Hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Create. Today we're going to be looking at physical animations. You may have seen this system before in Gang Beasts and in the game Tabs. That's Totally Accurate Battle Simulator. Physical animations allow you to use a mix of physics and your animations to create some really cool effects. It can be used for something more comical or for something more realistic. Your character can brush up against surfaces, their shoulders can react to the static props, so walls in your environment. Your character's hand can actually brush through things and interact with the world. And it doesn't require to do any specific programming, it's just a system inside of Unreal Engine 4. I hope you're all excited to go through this. Let's begin. In order to follow along with this Let's Create, make sure that you have the third-person template imported. Once you have that set up, go to the mannequin, character, and then mesh. In order to get the physical bodies working, we need to access the physics asset for this mannequin. So we're going to double click the physics asset, which will give us access to this window. If you haven't explored this before, this is where we can test and simulate how our characters would work with various physics bodies or ragdoll effects. So this is really useful, especially if you have a custom character, to make sure everything is working correctly. If you hit simulate, you'll notice the character will crumple and fall. And if you were using a custom mesh here, you could easily identify if anything was wrong and go fix that in Maya, Blender, or 3ds Max. For our case, we're using the mannequin. And what we need to do is set up the physics bodies. So we're going to create a profile. In order to create a profile, we need to go to Window, Physics Asset, and here we can create a physical animation profiles. And if you want, you can later create motor constraints, which will allow the physics bodies to interact in certain ways, but we're not going to cover that, and I'll have an additional resource for that in the link below in the description. Left click on the plus button for the physical animation properties, and to keep this simple, I'll call this the Let's Create Profile. I'm going to close this window, and I'm going to change the profile. So here I'm going to access the Let's Create Profile. And now by accessing this, I can select the pelvis. And the reason I'm not selecting the root is because I only want to select the bones and the joints. So the root is not part of this. It begins at the pelvis. We can scroll all the way down, hold Shift, and left click the last joint. And you should have all of these selected now. You can then go to Add to Profile, which is profile we created earlier. This gives you access to a bunch of properties, and this is really great for testing out how all this works. So I'm going to hit simulate again, and it's that same old effect. If you were to add some properties in here, say 1000, tab 100, and then tab 1000 and tab 100, and simulate, you'll notice the way forces affect him are a little different this time. And for those curious, if you don't make it a local simulation, you get some really interesting effects. You could probably tweak to make it usable, but we're going to stick to local, and I'll show you a little bit of how to use world once we have our blueprint set up. I'm going to retick this and hit simulate, and you may notice you can control right mouse to interact with bodies. So if you want to see how a character would potentially work, I'm going to deselect the pelvis. So just go to spline 01, shift click down here, and I can go to selected. So instead of simulating everything, I can simulate the selected. So make sure the pelvis isn't selected. Simulate. There we go. So this is an option. I forgot to mention that. If you click on selected, it's an option, then you can hit simulate. And if you are now to hold control and right mouse, you can see how the character would react when there's various forces applied to the character. And you can see how by disabling the pelvis, you can see how it affects the character, which is really interesting. I'm going to hit simulate to exit, get rid of selected. And now that we've set this up with our Let's Create Profile, we can save this and exit. And we can now begin getting into the blueprints. So go to Content, Third Person Blueprint, Blueprints, and open the third person character. There is a bit of setup before we begin adding in blueprints. So go to the viewport and let's set this up. The first thing we want to do is add a component. This component is going to allow us to access all the physical animation functions in blueprints. So add component, and we want to type in physical animation. This component itself does not have a bunch of things to modify, but if you want, you can modify the physical animation strength multiplier, and you can mess around with this later. But for this tutorial, we're going to leave this as is. We're going to go to our mesh and modify a few properties here. We need to set up the collision in a way where it won't be interacting with itself and causing problems when our character interacts and hits objects. In order to fix this up, we want to go and create custom. So change this to custom, collision preset. I changed this before as I was just checking out something. From collision enabled query only, change that to physics only, and then change this to world static, the object type. After changing that, we want to change the ignore. So we want a few of these to be ignored and not blocked. So we'll ignore these two. Then, after the world static and world dynamic, we can ignore all these. This will allow us to have the skeleton mesh not interact with our capsule component. If you were to try other settings, your character will most likely interact with the capsule component and cause undesired results. Once you've done all this, the only thing we want to do is go to the capsule component and go to the radius. We're going to set this to something like 11, and the reason why is so the actual physics bodies can interact and hit objects in the world. If you make the radius too big, all of these areas will not be able to interact with the world. So we're going to set that to 11, compiles, and save. Now we can get into the Throughprint section, and we're going to start with the event, begin play. And all this stuff just has to be set at the start. Nothing has to run in real time, which is really great. So drag out the physical animation, which we set up, and we're going to access the set skeletal mesh component and drag the event begin play into the set skeletal mesh component. This is going to allow us, the nodes, to understand what skeletal mesh we're referencing, and this is why we set up the physics, the asset body before. So if you go into the mannequin character mesh, we set up this physics asset before. In order to reference the proper physics asset, we need to tell it what mesh we're using, and in that case, it's the mesh here, and drag that into skeletal mesh component. The next thing we want to do is create apply physical animation settings. This is another node, so drag out from the physical animation and create the apply physical animation settings, and we're going to click below, and then we're going to connect this node to this node, and I'm going to double click on this wire just to clean it up a bit. So I'll drag this up here and make it look a bit nicer. The reason why we created this node is so we can modify the physical animation data, and you'll see in a second what we're going to create is very familiar to what we used before in the mannequin. So if I was to right click and create a node called make physical animation data, you'll notice these settings here, and it's very similar to what we were interacting with before, the local simulation and the strength. This is going to allow you to change how your character will interact with the world. So we want to drag this into the physical animation data. The body name, it wants to reference the bone name, I should say, is referencing the root bone. So we're going to create, and so right click and promote to variable. I'm going to call this the bone name. And just to double check, this will be the pelvis. So click on bone name, compile, and I'm going to call this pelvis. Compile and save that. And the physical animation settings below, it'll go to the pelvis and set all of these settings for every bone underneath the pelvis. That is why we chose it as it is the first one. If you were to choose something like the thigh, it would do everything beneath the thigh, and you may want to mess around with that if you want a particular character. So if you want a certain style of character. For these settings, let's try what we had before. So 1000, 100, 1000, and 100, and we're going to modify these later. And I'm going to show you how to do something more realistic and something a bit more silly, which will be quite fun. After you've set this up, we're going to grab our mesh again. And this time we're going to drag out and set all bodies below, simulate physics, and drag this out here. So we're going to apply physical animation settings to all the bones underneath the pelvis. And then we're going to set all those bones to simulate physics. And we're going to tick New Simulate, so they will all begin simulating. And if you want, you can double click here and drag out if you want to keep your wires nice. Hit compile and save. And we want to untick include self, as that will lead to undesired results. If you want to see what I mean, just leave those ticked and you can try it out yourself. Now that we've set this up, we should be able to minimize and hit play. And you notice our character will slump over and run, and it is all physics. It's driven by physics, and also it's using our animation. So it looks a bit drunk. And at the moment, when you run into walls, your camera is going to sometimes clip in. So to solve that, I'm going to go into the third person character, go to camera boom, and just disable the collision test. So if you see here, do collision test on the camera boom. So untick that, compile and save. I'm going to go back into play. I'm going to hit F11 to full screen this, and now your character will be running around. You can jump, and it'll have these different physics applied to it. If you jump here, you'll see the leg will go a bit weird, and the arms will try and stay on. And this is just with the settings that we've created. So this is something obviously a lot more goofy. And we can now modify what we've created in order to make something a bit more realistic or something even crazier than this. So inside of the third person character, we can modify what we have here. So if we untick is local simulation, and then we hit play, you'll notice that it's running a bit more realistically. So it's trying to keep to its run animation as much as possible due to our setting it being at 1000. You'll notice that the legs are a bit wonky. And you'll notice that it's still doing that physics simulation, but it can have a few strange results. So these settings here are the major things that are going to change how your character is interacting with the world. So if you were to set this to 700 as opposed to the 1000, you compile and save and play, you'll get different results. The last thing I want to show you with this system is how it interacts when other things directly hit you. So far we've got it so when you go onto an object or jump onto an object, your body is affected. Let's see what it looks like when something hits you. In order to do this, we're going to be creating a projectile and a turret. So we're going to create a new folder, call this Blueprints. Open the Blueprints folder, right click, and create a Blueprints class. This is going to be an actor, and it'll be called the BP underscore projectile. Open that up, and we want to add a component. The type is a sphere, and this is quite large, so we're going to make this something like 0.5 for the X, Y, and Z. And the other thing we want to do is make sure that it has collision. So double click on the static mesh, which will open up this window. If you hit simple collision, it has a collision here. I'm just going to remove it and add sphere sphere collision, and now it's all around in the place where it should be. We can hit save, close this, and now this sphere has proper collision on it. The other thing is we want to make sure that it is blocking all, so block all dynamic should work well. And now we want to right click and create another blueprint. We're going to create an actor and call this BP underscore turret. And for our turret, we're just going to create a cube. We're going to add a component which is an arrow, and this is going to tell us which way is forward. So we can see that in the scene. And then we're going to create a scene component, which will be the shoot or spawn projectile position. Oops, position. It doesn't have to be a child, you can unparent that if you like. And I'm just going to make sure it spawns a bit further out, somewhere around 100 should work well, if you can see that there. Compile and save that. Go to the event graph, I'm going to delete these. And we're just going to set up a very simple timeline. The only boolean we need here, the only variable I should say, we need here is a boolean, and we're going to call this can shoot. I'm going to compile and save. Make sure can shoot is true from the start. Right click and add a timeline. We're going to go in here and click autoplay and loop. You could just create an event tick as well. I'm going to drag out and create a branch. This branch will have a condition which is can shoot, so drag out can shoot, get, and drag that into the condition. If can shoot is true, we're going to drag this out again and set can shoot to false. That way it won't fire 100 or 200 every second. We're then going to drag out and type in spawn actor from class. The class is what we created before, which was the BP underscore projectile. And I just write BP because it's short for blueprint and it's easy to find, just like we did there. If you drag out the spawn projectile position, drag out to get the get transform, which should give you the get world transform, you can drag that into spawn transform. And from here, we can drag out and add force onto the object spawned. So get the return value and type in add force and add it to the sphere component. Drag out to this node here so they're connected. And the force is going to come from the arrow, the forward vector of the arrow, so the direction in front of the arrow, so type in forward and you'll get the forward vector. And if we were to multiply the forward direction of the arrow, so multiplication symbol, by a float, we can control how much force each projectile will have, and you can drag that into force. So I'm going to give this a ridiculous number because this is what I had to use before, and I had to tick acceleration change. After you've done this, this takes care of the spawning and shooting section. We then need to re-enable can shoot, so we'll have a delay, and this is going to be the cooldown time between each shot. So 1 second, and then drag this out, can shoot again, set to true, and now it can just loop through forever. So if we minimize this, drag out our turret, and rotate it, and hit play, it should be shooting forward. So we got a warning, simulate physics. Yep. So we need to go to our projectile, and in order for add force to work, we need to simulate physics. And this will allow them to fly out. I'm going to hit F11 to full screen, and what ideally would be happening is our character would be getting hit, but in this case it is not. So it may be a property of the projectile, so I'm going to go to the collision preset of the sphere and choose block all. I'm going to hit compile and save. So before it was physics body. Now I'm going to change the, so not anything else, just the sphere. I'm going to change that to block all in the collision. Hit play and let's try that again. And there we go. Now it's actually reacting and getting hit in those areas. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this look at the physical animations inside of Unreal Engine 4. I really like this feature and I want to figure out different ways I can implement it into my games. So sometime in the near future, hopefully I'll have an update on better ways to use this. What I wanted to do with this video in particular is just show off how to use it, as all the other tutorials online were an hour plus long and they did very similar things. So I wanted to give a more condensed version that you can follow that was really to the point, so you can implement this and mess around with it yourselves. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for similar content. If you want to support the creation of these videos, make sure to check out my Patreon, and you'll get a bunch of cool rewards if you join my Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.